Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next episode, our second one. I'm psyched to be here. I'm ready to talk about patient balances. And those of you who caught my post with Mark Cuban and John Stewart, I want to talk a little further about that. And probably going to do it in a few episodes. But I first want to talk about, kind of unpack a little bit about what Mark Cuban said. If you didn't catch it, quick rerun. Basically said hospitals are subprime lenders without any assets. And I think this is like a really, really good way to frame this conversation. I've been on the train of how did we get stuck collecting balances from patients because it's not our insurance. We didn't select the plan that they're in. We don't really have anything to do with it, frankly. We're negotiating a rate with the payer, and we just by chance, right, like end up with a balance. In fact, there's a couple companies in RevCycle, I'm not going to name them, that actually do the work to figure out and will hold claims so that they're not the first claim to come in on someone's deductible, which is crazy that that exists. Okay, it's crazy. Like, I get it, I get why it's happening, but it's also insane. So I think Cuban's like right on. Because if you think about like lending, and if you don't know a lot about lending, there's basically like four categories, like prime, prime plus. Subprime is high risk individuals, usually lower credit score. Credit score doesn't tell you everything, but it certainly tells you a fair amount. That's why we have it. And you lend to those people, like in the housing recession and the breakdown of a housing, right? Like we were giving whole mortgages and multiple mortgages to people in the subprime category, whereas today that's much, much harder for subprime lenders or for subprime people to get lending. But if you think about the health system, what they're stuck with is they're collecting balances, right, from patients who already probably came, even if they're doing some upfront collections, fine, but that's definitely not the majority. And those people have left. So it's not like you have an asset to take away. Like in the housing market, you had a house to take back. In this, you don't have anything. And we didn't usually select the balance that they're owed, right? Like I didn't tell them they owed $1,000 unless they're a cash patient, right? Like I don't even know what that number is. So I found it fascinating to break down that. I also found it fascinating to do some research around how did we end up with patient balances. So I'm probably going to do this in a few parts, but today I wanted to talk about how did we end up here. And there's a, I learned this in grad school actually, and I totally forgot about it. But there was there was a study, it's called the RAND study. It was done finished in 1981 and by the Rand Corporation, which I'm actually not sure exists anymore, but I think it does. And it was like highly regarded as like the research institute. And companies or groups would pay them to commission a study. They would go do it. It was kind of thinking of it as like today's McKinsey, right? Like, back when McKinsey was super highly respected, but like they still are, I think, and they should be. And like this was kind of that level, right? What they did was they wanted to research and understand the impact of different health insurance designs, and particularly if they had levels of cost sharing, so co-payments, right? What did it do to the utilization and, in theory, the outcomes? And it is a fascinating study because I actually think that this 1981 study, by the way, which is, let's do the math, almost 45 years old, 45 plus years old, right? So it's 45 years old is the reason we're in some of the predicament that we are today. Now, I say that with a caveat, and I'll tell you more about the RAND study. The caveat is that back in the 30s, actually, the Blues actually introduced deductibles and some type of cost sharing. And it's fascinating, right? This nonprofit, but I'm sure they were just copying the other insurance models that were home insurance, and right, like those would have been commonplace. And so I'm sure they were just kind of copying that in some way, and then the rise of employer employer-sponsored health insurance in the 1940s and 50s, right after World War II kind of got done, and all this kind of like started to kind of advance. And they were, of course, this came about because healthcare costs were rising. More people were utilizing healthcare services, right? Before they weren't really, not as much. And so they took 7,000 participants, randomly assigned. This is all in California, by the way. And they followed them for 2 or 3 years, depending. Now, the study lasted like 5 years, but they really were only following people for 2 or 3 years. And what they found, this is kind of like here's what they found. They found that reduced utilization with higher copays. Makes sense, right? Like, in graduate school, we learned there's another study that was similar. It was like even $5 would reduce the amount of people going to the, particularly like your primary care physician, right? And they also identified that there was no significant health effects, as in long term. I'm going to quote long term here. I'm using a fair amount of quotes in this because long term to them was like 3 years, right? Like it wasn't over the course of like 10, 15 years. They didn't see this, major significant impact or negative impact, and it reduced people's utilization, right? This is in theory a way to ration. Like we don't want to call it that, but this is rationing care. However, there are a number of issues with the RAND study, and particularly they didn't really look at and distinguish between people who had money and people who didn't have money. So think about our like highest risk patients or one's socioeconomic status may not be as high. A $20 copay to someone like you or me, potentially, right? Like if you have money, if you're getting paid, you have a job, I'm well established, right? It almost means nothing to me. Like even a $2, this is why I think it's fascinating, is like the rise of how much like ER copays are. Like if my kid's sick, I'm taking them to the ER. I'm taking them to the ER if I think they should go to the ER. I can give a shit about whether it's a $500 copay. It almost doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. However, if I don't have any money, or I have a limited amount of money, that's very limited, let's say I'm a single mom, which is what I grew up in, who didn't have a lot of money. We didn't go to the freaking doctor. Like, and I'm sure I was on Medicaid. I don't even remember, right? But I'm probably sure I'm on Medicaid. We still didn't go. Like, I didn't go that much. And I can't imagine if I was sick and I wasn't on Medicaid and we're just working and kind of trying to make it, right? So it's almost like the RAND study, which is what everyone's basing this insurance of like giving it more to the person because we want to limit the amount that they're going. It didn't take into effect socioeconomic. The other thing it did not take into effect, which is the obvious one, is the fact that like they didn't do long-term outcomes of health. And if you think about even just the pandemic for a second, or people putting off some routine care, right? A lot of people all of a sudden found out, oh, I actually have this like heart disease that I didn't work on for 3 years, or I had cancer. I didn't realize it because I didn't go to the doctor, right? Think about this over a long period of time. I'm not going to the doctor because I don't want to pay the copay, or let's say, for instance, I have a high deductible plan and I'm paying all of it up to $10,000. You think that's not rationing of care? That's absolutely rationing of care. So we're already saying ration care. What's fascinating is like how much this is proliferated everywhere, right? And I don't think anyone fully understands how much of an impact it has on long-term health. Because if I'm not going to go see routine services because I'm just avoiding it, versus like I think everyone's fear, this was talked about in the RAND study, the fear was everyone's just going to go to the doctor all the time and no one's going to care. And it's like, that isn't true. I'm not going to the doctor unless I have to, right? Like there's almost no scenario. Of course, now we've gotten to trying to get into more preventative care, but even that is like, who's driving that? And how are we paying for that? And do people really see the benefits of it? So I find it fascinating that the RAND study is kind of this like one thing that is really kind of the is kind of a cornerstone of how we got to where we're at today. Now, how it is that we're responsible, and I'm saying we as in like the health system or the physician, how are we responsible for collecting a balance in which we did not decide? That is still unclear. Now, I'm guessing it's partly because the way some other insurances would work is that you would pay this amount to like the dealership on your car, right? I just had a window got cracked on my brand new car, which is crazy. There's $100 deductible. You have to pay that. Okay, fine. But there's such a big difference between paying that. I can't have this service done even. I can't even get it started unless I pay my deductible. And I am paying it to the dealership. But in this case, most cases, right? If I don't take it to the insurer's place, I actually have to pay out of pocket and then get reimbursed, right? And I do think that there are ways that we can get around this, like change this system to actually become like a system that would actually work. And I've got a number of ideas. I want to break into a bunch of them, but I wanted to just first talk about the RAND study and its importance and the cornerstone of how I think we got to the place we're in. And hopefully that was informative for everybody. I'm going to come back next week with another take on starting to talk about what I think we should do and the biggest things that are impacting it. So hopefully that was fun, or at least interesting. Loved being with you guys again this week. Hopefully you'll catch it, and I'll catch you next week. Thanks, everybody.